Welcome back or welcome to the Train Right podcast. I'm your host, Coach Adam Pulford. As I alluded to in my episode intro, I've got the former CEO of CTS on the show today, as well as the current CEO, Chris Carmichael and Jeff Pierce. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Adam.
Thanks, Adam.
Yeah. Well, Chris, you've been on the podcast before, and clearly you need no intro. So I'll simply ask you, how's life and what are you up to now that you don't have a job anymore?
Well, I still work for CTS and coach a few athletes and have a board seat and still involved with the company and have been assisting Jeff during this transition. And I would say we're pretty much out of transition. Jeff's got both hands on the wheels and foot to the floor, full throttle going ahead. But, I've never really been busier. I don't know what I'm so busy with. It's kind of almost hard to, I get to the end of the day and it's like, what did I actually do? But a lot has really been centered on, I had my knee replaced 12 weeks ago, a little over 12 weeks ago now. And a lot has been in kind of rehabbing my knee from the knee replacement, and did my longest ride, which was about 50 miles a couple days ago with my girlfriend, Sarah, and former CTS athlete, Mari Holden. I definitely suffered, and Mari dropped me pretty quickly on the last hill, and so did Sarah, and I limped in. But so that's my life right now. Reading a lot and enjoying time with my youngest daughter, who's in school at Santa Barbara High. So having fun.
Awesome. No, that's really good to hear, and as it should be right now, and still coaching. You can't take the coaching out of a coach, so it's good to hear that you're still coaching too. So, Jeff, for those who have been around the sport, kind of at the elite end, or as an athlete, a fan, an enthusiast, they also know who you are. But for those who don't, could you tell our audience a bit more about you? Kind of your background a little bit in cycling in the business world and where you're at now.
Sure, Adam. I got my start in cycling with the Wolverine Sports Club in Detroit. My family moved from Pennsylvania to Detroit, Michigan, and there aren't many people that would say, hey, that was a lucky move. My family moved me to Detroit, but I probably wouldn't have been into cycling had that not happened. There's this fantastic club and culture there in that area that did a amazing job with bringing up cyclists and producing even world-class cyclists. I was just a 15-year-old kid when I started, so I had a long way to go, but race that was all sponsored by Schwinn. Then I went on to race with Schwinn, the Schwinn national team, Schwinn Icy Hot, for a number of years. And right around 1985, Jim Okowitz was putting together the first team, U.S. team, to go ride in the Tour de France. And he needed 10 riders, but he didn't feel like he had 10 riders on the team that were really cut out for the Tour. So he asked me if I wanted to ride the Tour with them. I said, sure. So I was a guest rider, so to speak, on the 7-Eleven team the very first year of the Tour in 86. And went on after that in 87 and beyond to join the 7-Eleven team full time. Came back to the U.S. in about 1991 after having been in Europe for a number of years, and then raced with the Chevrolet LA Sheriff's team, brought them up to sort of through the pro ranks, and they became one of the premier teams in the United States, and did fairly well internationally too, even though we were just based in North America. So that was another fun project. Moved on into the real world, so to speak. went into publishing. First job was with Bicycling Magazine. That was Rodale Press. Then went on to Wenner Media, which is Rolling Stone, Us, and Men's Journal. Then on to GT. And that was my first connection with CTS. My mountain bike manager was Dean Golich, who was one of the originals with CTS, the original gangsters, who basically started all of the coaching. And he was a interesting guy. But from there, went on to USA Cycling and did the same job Chris did, which was, I don't know what the title was exactly, vice president of athletics, or basically the head of the performance department. And while there, sold a sponsorship to T-Mobile for a women's program, and that program took off. Then I eventually left and went off back into the real world again at T-Mobile and Telcom for another 13, 14 years. So got a good education in the world outside of cycling through that. Got sucked back in, came back to USA Cycling again after leaving T-Mobile, again in the sort of the performance job, the director of sports performance there. And from there, that was another 5 years or so. We figured out Chris was my neighbor at one point after we had both lived on the same street for almost 6 months. And sitting in this office here now, I'd see Chris riding by every day. And so we'd chat a few times a week. And I think when Chris was getting ready to make this transition, he started thinking about me as one of the candidates. And I thought it was a great proposition and a great challenge that I decided, that would be a good idea to take that on. So here I am. My entire history there in 3 or 4 minutes. So
yeah, 3 or 4 minutes. So basically, you just need to be Chris Carmichael's neighbor to become the CEO of CTS. Is that what I'm hearing?
I'm not sure. Maybe it was just he just kept seeing me, and so the frequency maybe helped a little bit. But no, we had a lot of great conversations through some tough times with in the world and with CTS with COVID, and we'd sit out back in the fire pit sometimes and talk while we're drinking a beer, and so we had been talking about CTS for a few years before this actual official transition ever happened. So it was pretty natural. It felt like, and almost somewhat organic to happen that way. Us being teammates many, many years ago, us having the same job as the head of performance at USA Cycling, and now both involved with CTS.
Yeah, and that's kind of the point, kind of tongue in cheek, is your guys' shared commonalities and kind of the Venn diagram of your careers and your life have really shared a lot of space, and I don't know the exact years, but Chris, back when you started racing in Florida, around that same time period, I think Jeff was. Kind of started a little bit more than you, but like what was kind of so new or different at the time when you started racing? Was there coaching? Was there kind of high performance athletics going on when you started racing a bike, or tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I was fortunate as well. Jeff mentioned he was part of the Wolverines cycling team, and that club is famous. It's produced a lot of great champion cyclists, and they had a really good infrastructure from everything that I could tell. I feel very fortunate growing up in South Florida. There was a big influence of Cuban cyclists and the cycling community there, and I got asked to join the Cuban Bicycle Club, and there would be rides after school every Tuesday and Thursday, and we'd leave from Coconut Grove, we'd ride out over Biscayne Bay, over to Key Biscayne and back. And there was always a coach behind in a car. And he'd honk the horn, and then we'd have to, sprint and he'd come up and yell at us in Spanish, and I'd do the best to try to understand. And but there was a good infrastructure. The interesting thing about cycling back then, there was basically only two flavors of cycling. You were road cycling or you were track cycling, and that was it. And there was a really defined sort of etiquette for cycling. And you'd start off 2x2, and it'd usually 10-minute pulls, and you pull off to the side. The other two people come in, and then you'd transition to the back to, and we'd have 30 kids out there, and then there'd be, you get on a pace line, and everything was very programmed, and that etiquette was really important for learning how to ride, how to follow a wheel, how to draft, how to be in an echelon, and then there would be kind of race simulation sort of things. And like I said, very programmed, but you really learned the fundamentals of road cycling. And I really feel like that was very helpful for me in my cycling career, because I learned early on how to draft, and how important that was. And I learned the advantages of being able to sit tight on a wheel and not wasting energy. And I also learned the disadvantages, that you could be the strongest out there, but if you're not smart and you're not able to use your energy and you're kind of giving it away, your chance of winning is greatly reduced. So, cycling's changed a lot over the years, but some of that etiquette, it really stuck with me, and I think it helped me a lot through my cycling career, on the national team, racing internationally, racing at the pro level as well.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. In Jeff, for you, was the Wolverine Sports Club, was it similar in that vein of kind of organized cycling etiquette? Was it, does it have more of a sports science edge of it, or tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is the 1970s, so sports science was not necessarily much of a thing yet, right? It was everything that you learned was basically passed down information from one generation to the next, or from someone that's done a little bit more and traveled and raced a little bit more and passes it, down to the ones that are starting. But fortunately, we did have a coach in Mike Walden, and he is probably the most prolific cycling coach. Other than Chris now, I can take credit for a lot more cyclists than Mike Walden did, but he was just an amazing coach. And basically, yes, taught you how to ride, taught you how to race, taught you how to train, all of those things. And it was both road and track. So I had joined them on a few road rides, the club, and he says, you need to get on the track. And I'm like, I don't have a track bike. He says, we'll get you one. So he says, come out Tuesday at 6:00, Doré Velodrome. So you had to drive the entire length of 8 Mile Road in Detroit to get to the Doré Velodrome. And it was a little bit of a sort of a scary place to pass through at that time. But you got there, and there were like 30, 40 people all at the track riding around. And he gives me this chrome Paramount track bike, and I'm like, cool. So I start riding it, and he just sat on the infield and screamed at everybody for about 2 hours nonstop, And so the thing he used to yell at me was, he says, Pierce, get off the front. He says, I know you're strong. You just need to learn how to ride. So I was like, hell no, I'm not getting off the front. That is scary back there. And there's no brakes and you can't coast. And I'm just figuring this out, So then I asked him, I think the second or third time I was out at the track, I'm like, hey, where'd this bike come from? He goes, oh, that was Sue's bike last year. That was Sue Navarra's hand-me-down, who was a world champion on the track at that time. And it was like, wow, that's a good place to start. But that was the nature of that club. You had world champions, you had, 11-year-old kids and everybody in between out there all training and working out together. And it was just an amazing atmosphere and an amazing culture to get started in.
Yeah. So you guys, essentially didn't know each other at the time. Was it national team or 7-Eleven, Chris, when you and Jeff first met or kind of knew of each other?
I'm not really sure. Funny, I'm going to put out an old story. I remember racing on that velodrome, Jeff, in 1974. Me and my brother were going to the National Road Championships in Milwaukee, and we went and did a criterium in Birmingham, Detroit, that area. And then we did some track racing. There was like a couple days of track racing before that crit. And my only other experience riding the track was we had track racing down in South Florida. We'd go out to this old car racing track, and we it was banked, and I don't know how long it was, but it seemed much longer. But I remember the banking was much steeper than that track in Detroit, but we might have met then, Jeff. I don't know if our paths crossed then, but it was probably on the national team. I think probably at a national team camp or something like that, or a trip where we probably first crossed paths.
I remember you guys coming out, and Dave Ware, and was it Stowe team for a while, I think. Yeah. So we've been racing with each other off and on, I think, for years before we got to the national team level. And 7-Eleven, we probably weren't always aware of it, but Stowe was a fairly famous team at that time there. And I was just one of the guys in the red and white Schwinn jerseys, because there was a Schwinn club in Detroit. There's a Schwinn club in Chicago. There was another Schwinn club in Milwaukee. And these are all places that had tracks and had a ton of racing all summer long. So we didn't have to travel very far to get to racing.
Did you do Tour Tallahassee, Jeff? I think that's maybe where we crossed paths, because there's a national team camp right after that, I think.
Yeah, that was our summer or our spring training ground. So I went to Michigan State University, and it's cold there in March when we had spring break. But every spring break, we'd head down to Tallahassee and train. The day we got out, we were in the van that night and training the next day down in Florida, and would come back the evening before we had to be back in class again. So we did that for years. And I do remember racing Tour of Tallahassee around that time as well. Yeah.
I mean, it's talking with both of you and also just hearing up these stories that randomly, cross paths. I mean, you share a lot of bonds, the friendship starts to run deep when you're suffering next to each other, kind of week in and week out, year in and year out. And, one story that pops out in my head is that Grand Prix in La Jolla, Chris, that I think that you're talking about, where you two were off the front. It's pretty clear you guys were going to win, right? How did that shake out, and how did you guys decide how the outcome would happen?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, we were long gone. No one was catching us. And this was a race that went on for 2 or 3 years. And Richard Brine, who went on to then be Speed Play Pedals, and I think he's still in the industry, was the race promoter at the time. But I think there were claims of something like 20,000 fans, spectators at this race. It was like 10, 12 deep all the way down the home stretch, and the entire course was lined. Probably would have been around 85 84, 5, 83, somewhere in that era. Yeah. No, probably 80, right around 85, maybe.
Yeah.
84, 85. But massive crowds, really high energy sort of atmosphere. All the best guys in the country would come out for that. Also had a pretty, well, it's not huge by today's standards, but it was a good prize list. And Chris and I are gone, and our teams are both working to keep us gone, betting on. We were pretty evenly matched at that time, so it wasn't like obvious one over the other was going to win. And then I remember they put up the crowd preem, so they had crowd preem, so they'd go around the crowd and collect money in buckets or whatnot. That with one to go was the crowd preem. The next lap was the race, and I'm like, yep, I can win both of these. Yep, I can do it. So I went for the crowd preem, got it, and probably Chris was a little cagier, and he ended up beating me in the sprint. And I remember seeing that picture. I was like making a left turn, just trying to get as far away from him as possible. Once I realized I wasn't going to win, I didn't want to even be in the shot. But later on that evening, my team was actually pretty happy with me because I got a shoebox full of money, and we dumped it out on the bed, and there was like $1,000 in this shoebox. It was amazing. And it was coins and dollar bills and 10s and 5s and 20s. And it was, you could put quite a bit of money in a shoebox, as it turns out. So, but that was some pretty good racing and pretty good memories. And I did go back the next year and managed to win the next year. So
that's good.
I redeemed myself. Yes.
And no hard feelings between you two still.
No.
Okay. Just checking. Yeah. I mean, I think that's, again, kind of the, both of you just racing and kind of sharing these experiences over time. I mean, it's pretty cool to see two teammates, competitors, friends, now business partners and neighbors, coming together like this, which is super amazing. And, the other thing that kind of stands out to me as I was kind of creating this storyline is just, both of you, I mean, Chris, you shaped an industry that didn't exist before. Mind blowing. You impacted the sport of cycling in a way that, no one else has. You created something completely different. And, Jeff, both of you kind of pioneering the sport on the 7-Eleven team, and then into your work at USAC, both of you really shaping the U.S. and globally what cycling has looked like for the past 40 years. And, Olympic selection is something that can, ruffle feathers for a lot of people. And we'll talk more about kind of how that's done these days. But Chris, I'll ask you, how did you guys do an Olympic selection back in the day? Like, what did that look like? Because you're both vying for the Olympic team back in 84-ish, right?
They had the Olympic trials, and if you won, it was a series of 3 road races. It was in Spokane, Washington. And they were tough courses. I think the 2 were on the same course, like a 10-mile or something like that sort of loop. And then the other, I think, was just 2 laps of a bigger loop. And but tough, hilly terrain, supposed to mimic what the terrain that the Olympics in Mission Viejo were going to be on, and a few months later. And I think based upon performances in the Olympic trials and national team trips that year, the coaches and the head coach was Eddie Borshevitz, or Eddie B, a sort of legendary coach in U.S. cycling. Unfortunately, he's passed away. I believe it was last year. From COVID, which was, a loss. But there were some athletes that were kind of automatic selection through that Olympic trials process. And then there was a couple guys, a couple spots, I believe, that were doubling up riding the team time trial. It was a 4-person team time trial, and actually 4-man team time trial. They only had men. They didn't. The UCI didn't think women could ride team time trial events, I guess, and so there's only a men's event, and then there were 4 in the road race, and we were vying for. There were 3 of us, myself, Jeff, and another teammate of ours from 7-Eleven, Jeff Bradley from Iowa. Were vying for the last spot on that Olympic team, and the coach, Eddie B, said, well, we're going to go out to the course and to the Olympic course, and I'm going to motor pace you guys. I'll stand up on top of hills and wave my flag, and at the end, the strongest athlete will make that final selection, and it seemed like a really kind of weird way to do it because there were 3 of us, was, nobody else, and really kind of a random way to do it. And I had a good day and felt, really awesome. And I was hitting, being, I think most of those, I was the first to Eddie B's, hat he was waving. And then I think Jeff said, Eddie, I think Chris is the strongest guy. And so, it was kind of weird because we're all, well, I guess, we weren't teammates with Bradley, but we're all pretty close, and it just seemed like really kind of a strange way to do it. And I know I wouldn't do it that way anymore. But that's the way it happened. At least that's my memory of it, Jeff.
That's where you guys
were. Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah.
It's funny. Chris would ride by the house here, and once in a while he'd stop by, pull in the driveway. I'd see him. We'd go out and talk. He goes, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "I've got 40 sets of selection criteria to write in the next 2 weeks." Right. So when I was at USA Cycling the first time, we created sort of this structure, which is still used today on team selections. And as much as it gets abused in the media when somebody doesn't get selected, there's always somebody who doesn't get selected, right? Mm-hmm. And then people like to throw their opinions around. It's actually a very good process, and the U.S. Olympic Committee said that is actually one of the best ones we have, and they use it as a model for a lot of other sports. But it is a ton of work, and writing all of that criteria and then proofreading it and making sure the strategies make sense. And you do, in the end, you have to write all this so far in advance. You have to make sure it actually does get you your best athletes. So I was sitting here stuck in that. This is 20 years later at my most recent tenure at USA Cycling. And Chris brings up, you remember in 84 when the selection was, hey, when there's a guy standing on top of a hill waving his hat, you had to sprint. And I'm like, holy, I had blanked that out of my mind. And I'm like, because it wasn't one of my better days. And I'm like, yeah, I do remember that. And I'm just like, I forgot about the guy. I think it was the time was Eddie and Eddie B and Ed Burke were on the different places in the course, standing there waving their hat, at the top of a hill. Oh, that means we have to sprint. Let's go, and so it is done a little differently these days. And
incredible.
But the selection is always going to be a very tough topic, and there's lots of different ways to approach it. But good points and challenges exist in all of them. So
yeah, it's evolved since then. But I was telling you, Pierce, yesterday, I was like, that story from 84. I'm like, I wrestled for 20 plus years, and the way we made teams was you had wrestle-offs, man versus man, compete, whoever won made the team. So I'm like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. But now it's evolved.
That would be
it's
great
evolved for the better.
Yeah, in cycling, if there weren't teams, if you had 10 guys wrestling 10 other guys, it would be a whole different equation, right? So when it's one-on-one,
you want to see cyclists wrestle.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, that's no, it's kind of joking aside there too. It's, as I said before, the way that you guys have kind of, shaped and pioneered the industry and the sport. It's legendary, and Chris, to you, kind of creating the job that a lot of us do. Pierce and I were talking about yesterday. It's like, we were just at the USA Cycling Summit, and, just a big room full of tons of people, some that I, known for years and some new people. And Jeff said, he's like, yeah, whether they know it or not, they're here because of Carmichael.
I appreciate the kind words, and there were for sure others. I don't, Joe Friel and comes to mind, and other kind of early coaches in, but it's just the sport of cycling. Almost everybody was afraid to call themselves a coach. It was like nobody really. It's like cycling, you don't have coaches, and that was kind of how it was brought. As how I went through cycling early. And it always seemed kind of strange, so, I just had it in my mind that there were a lot of people out there that, when I was leaving US Cycling, that there were a lot of people out there that were already cyclists and not elite athletes, that wanted to know how to train and, how to ride their bikes and how to do it more efficiently, how to do it more effectively, and how to do it more enjoyably. And I remember a lot of people, well, aren't you a trainer or are you a coach? And I was like, no, we coach. That's what we do. And we're not trainers. Yeah, training's part of coaching, but coaching's so much more than just training, and there's so much. I think if you're doing it right, so to speak, it's really a holistic approach. You're looking at all the factors that affect performance for the athlete. And that's most of the time, what I've seen at really all levels of the sport, the limitations aren't physiological. They're really, it's what's going on up there in the athlete's head. That's usually where the limitation exists. And that's, a trainer's not going to do that. It's a coach, somebody that helps them, inspires them, get them to believe maybe something they could achieve, something that they, never thought they could achieve. So that inspiration is really important aspect to coaching, being able to inspire your athletes. Now, coaching in the cycling world has continued to evolve. We've seen, as Jeff said, in the 70s, really, sports science was not very evolved, but so much of cycling now is data driven by all the devices and things out there to measure our key biometrics and things like that. And that's great, because now, we're not guessing, have strong data to back up decisions that are made by the coach and the athlete together, or a group of people. And so that's good, but I still believe strongly that, coach will never be replaced by some sort of AI, artificial or machine learning type of device. I think we all long for that human connection, and that's whether it's you're a musician, you're an artist, you're a doctor, you're a bike racer. That human connection is really important to be able to help athletes through the hard times, help inspire them to do things that they don't think that they can do, that the coach can see that where the athlete needs to get to. And a lot of times the athlete puts a lot of barriers onto what they think they can possibly do. So, I think a coach's job is to be able to strip that away and inspire them that they can, and here's the path how to do it. And the data is important to guide the athlete, but that inspiration, that human connection, you just can't, no machine's going to do that, that's why coaching will always remain as a strong industry in my view.
Yeah, no, I agree with that fully. And I've seen, there's a lot of AI out there right now. There's a lot of a new technology that helps us coaches do a better job. And I lean into that because there's some amazing tools out there, but I have not yet seen anything that's going to replace the coach. I think that, there will be coaches that would be kicked out the back if they don't utilize some of that technology. But that's just, I would say that's many industries that have a heavy data and a heavy tech sort of component to what they're doing. But also, doing the hard work of coaching is not just like the data, the science, the psychology. It's taking all of that together. And I think that, my history of CTS, like it was a bit gruesome at first, kind of getting up, growing through the ranks of, creating training programs and just getting like riddled apart of how terrible that training program was and how to do it better. And when I look back on that, I'm like, in the moment, I was like, what the hell am I doing here? I don't think I should be here at all. But fast forward to the here and now, I think that high standard that you set, the high standard that a lot of the Dean and a lot of these other coaches set for us younger coaches was just what CTS needed to become the best in the world, in my opinion. And so, I'll turn to you, Jeff, in the way of, we're probably we're the biggest and probably the best endurance coaching company in the world, or I'd say in the United States right now, likely in the world. I don't know. What's your plan to keep CTS kind of at that pointy end of the spear as we keep on evolving with the AI, the data, and the kind of the new demands of the sport?
Yeah, so we just finished up 3 days of strategy meetings with the leadership team at CTS, and it was good to hear some of the old stories about how they trained the coaches in the early days, and I was like, "Holy cow!" They were brutal. They were brutal with the education process with the coaches, and I think the intention there was we want to make sure we're producing the best coaches in the world, and that they live up to the standards. There's always been an incredibly high standard for the coaches through CTS. You mentioned the coaching seminar we were just at USA Cycling, and if you looked around the room, there was an awful lot of CTS alumni in that room, including the ones teaching the level 1 courses, both of them CTS alumni, a lot of the other coaches who have maybe started their own companies or were involved in other ways, CTS alumni. So it's not just the coaches now that are our CTS, but we created this pretty large infrastructure of knowledge and coaches and process and procedure that is there, through today. So that is definitely the core of the business, and there are probably some ways of coaching or methods of coaching that are not necessarily as involved as the one-on-one, and you're hearing a lot about that now, but I think that is always going to remain the core of CTS, is that one-on-one coaching. We do other things as well, but and then maintaining that high standard. We don't just bring coaches on. There's a pretty good process for finding them. And then once they're found, there's a lot of education that takes place before they actually even start coaching their first athletes. So we have a process that they go through, and it's a number of months that it takes to go through it all before they even start coaching their first athlete. So we will always keep that standard high. And there may be different methods of executing it now. I heard stories of tying people together and sending them up the incline as a team building exercise or some such thing. And I was like, holy cow. We actually did the incline, which is, for people that don't know, is this big giant stairway that just goes straight up the mountain just outside of Colorado Springs. We did that on our last day for fun and apparently for old time's sake, but that was one of the exercises. No, they didn't tie us up. We all just went up on our own accord, but it was a fun exercise. But I think maintaining those standards and the integrity and the core values of what CTS is all about is that will always be there. I mean, the world has been through, some pretty tough times in the last few years, and there've been a lot of events canceled, and CTS weathered all that. So I think at this point we are going to return to instilling some growth back into the industry and in the sport, and at the same time doing it the way it's always been done at CTS to the very highest standards.
Yeah, no, that's just it. And, I think with COVID helping to change the landscape a bit, with the number of racing days change, the events with gravel kind of exploding, we're in a changing landscape with the events and the interests that our athletes, have for their goals. So I guess, before we wrap this thing up, first to you, Chris, I guess, where do you see endurance sport or endurance competitions going, and how does endurance coaching kind of fit or evolve with that? If you could answer that based on everything that you've seen from Florida to the Olympics to the Tour de France to now.
It's incredible the evolution of the technology and how we've been able to quantify really what is going on with the athlete, when they're under, race conditions and or actually racing. We so much before we were just guessing, and because there was no way to measure a lot of these things. I remember when the first power meter came out, the SRM, and even before the SRM, Look made up a hub, and we did some testing with that measured power, and we did some aerodynamic testing with Lance Armstrong on the velodrome, and this was back in, I think it was 93, right after he won the world championships, and you had to manually recall that, and the data, and it's evolved so rapidly, and to be honest, at this stage, it's great, because now we have, as we get answers to these questions, so many new questions come up that we didn't even think about as we now have these answers, and that's wonderful. The influence of social media on performance is massive. There's nowhere to hide anymore. Athletes really, you have to have, a brand, so to speak. You are the brand, and you've got to. That's an important part of you performing out there. Is before we had teams, we had all these things now, and there's still teams, at the World Tour road cycling level, but now individuals have really become their own brands, and social media dictates a lot of that, and that's great. More people are able to make a living from from bike racing and whatever form of bike racing that is. But there's a lot more pressures on athletes, that weren't necessarily as apparent before. You could kind of turn it off. Now it's on 24/7, 365. And, I worry a little bit about the mental health side of athletes. And athletes are always first. They're the center of everything. And then, it kind of goes out from there. And coaches are a sphere out from the athlete in the middle. And I worry about the influence social media is having on athletes. I worry, I've said this before, what about the athlete who, isn't very snarky, isn't very funny, he's kind of quiet, maybe he's got got a wart on his nose or something, but you put him on a bike and he's a fucking assassin, but he has no, and skills. That social media presence is so important. And so I worry, where is a place for that sort of athlete, and I can tell you, Pep, Andy Hampton, for example, he was a guy who kind of always did his own sort of thing. And I couldn't imagine that, another, and, went on, won 2 Tour de Suisses, 1 Tour of Italy, Alpe d'Huez. What about an Andy Hampton coming up through the ranks now? Is there room in the sport, mainly driven by social media, for the next Andy Hampton? And so I worry about the influence of social media on our sport. But I do believe in sport. I believe that it's good for our society. It's good. The more international competitions, the less chances of having wars. And so I believe in sport. I believe it's inherently good for all of us. And so I think we'll kind of work our way through the dynamics of social media, but I think there's going to be some rocky times, and because of some of that, but I do believe that we'll find our way through it.
Yeah, no, agreed. And especially at the elite end of things, right? Like that's where, racing on Saturday, Sunday, and come Monday, you take a rest day and you're back to training. It's all about socials, selling, sell yourself, sell the product, that kind of thing. Completely agree with that. I'd say to you, Jeff, with kind of the gravel boom and maybe with COVID, inspiring people to think outside of even the event space for our athletes, kind of the self challenges, the Everesting, the FKTs. Where do you see the sport of just endurance athletics pertaining to what you're now kind of doing at CTS, and how did they kind of coalesce together?
No, that's a great question and a great observation. I think traditional racing as we knew it, Chris and I coming through the system, has changed a lot. And the grassroots is maybe not quite as strong as it was at one time. And there's so many different ways to do it, so many different disciplines to engage people with now, that I think you have to be constantly sort of scanning that landscape and making sure you're serving the athletes in whatever form they may take. And the gravel is a great example of that. And then even just say some older athletes that are getting a chance to return to the sport and want to be fast, want to be competitive, want to be keeping up with the group or up with their buddies. They're all athletes, and they're all recognizing there is so much out there, so much information, so many tools to use. And I think the idea of coaches is actually becoming very easily accepted for the athletes on whatever scale it is that they're competing on or challenging themselves with. So I think there's always going to be a place for great coaching and great coaches, and that is our aim, to make sure we're there for them when they're ready to take that on. So yeah, it sounds like, old guys talking about, well, back in the day, there was just road racing and track racing. It is pretty much true. And now you've got single speed cyclocross racing and mountain biking and gravel racing and road racing and track racing and BMX. Well, BMX been there forever, but, or almost forever, but, there's just so much more going on and so many different ways to challenge yourself. And I think that's the key is, you're there to meet, those folks, where they are and whatever it is that they, want to achieve and help them achieve that.
Yeah, 100%. And in my own coaching practice, I mean, working with world tour professionals all the way down to the weekend warrior, one of the common things that I tell my athletes, and no one's disagreed with me yet, is just like, when you're fit, everything's more fun. And, suffering next to your buddy on the weekend, or attacking that huge hill that you never thought you could, or simply just, having a beer with your friend at the end of it. Like when you're fit, all of those experiences are just so much better. And that's where I think somebody like a coach that has all the experiences with the sport psychology, the sport physiology, kind of the tech and data end of things. I mean, obviously I'm biased here, but when you have somebody that can come in and kind of help answer some of those questions for you, so you can simply have more fun in the stuff that you love to do. I mean, that's a lot of what people are interested in, whether they're chasing gold medals or not, because it's the same for everybody. That I think the speeds are just drastically different, right?
Yeah. No, it was one of the observations I made, having been recently at the very, very top of the sport, working with world champions and Olympic champions and so on. And now kind of spreading out a little broader than that. It is every bit as exhilarating and exciting to see someone meet their goal, even if that goal was to finish a 140-mile gravel race in under 9 or 10 hours. And they are every bit as pleased with that and thrilled with that as someone winning an elite athlete winning a medal at a world championship or an Olympic Games. So it's a great feeling to be there and to be able to help all levels of athletes, achieve those goals.
Couldn't agree more. Well, we are coming up on the end of our time together, and I really want to thank you both for making time in your day to do this podcast. I think, like I said in my intro, it was it's kind of a cool time period to do this with the end of the year, some reflection, and kind of this big change in CTS with the chapter essentially churning. And for our audience who, maybe wondered what Chris is up to and who this new Jeff guy is, I think we've been able to, answer some of those questions and tell some good stories about kind of how this came to be, new CEO of CTS. I think that's pretty awesome. We also talked about, the future of CTS, the future of endurance sport in general. And I don't know, I had a great time today on the podcast, guys. So is there anything that you want to add into that we may have left out, or anything else?
I'll just add that I feel incredibly lucky and grateful. I've been able to surround myself with fantastic coaches from the beginning of starting the company, and then being able to have Jeff. We all have nicknames on 7-Eleven. His nickname's Peppy, and having Pep take over as CEO, it's really sort of like if I was writing out a script, I couldn't have written out anything that would make me happier, and to feel like that's really what I wanted to achieve, was to build something that would last beyond me. And when I started, I could have, decided to just keep going and being, me. And but I wanted to impact more people, and was able to do that through coaching and helping, playing a role in helping develop coaches. And now my chapter's closed, and Jeff is opening a new chapter of CTS, and it's incredibly gratifying. And I just, want to, in 20 years, I'll be, 80, coming up on 85. And so I hopefully I'm still around, and I can look and go, what's CTS doing now? And pretty sure you won't be there, Jeff, but because you're even a year or two older than me, so somebody else will have, maybe there have been a couple that have taken over, and where it goes, it's just, it's great. And it's good. I remember when you walked in the door, Adam, it was like, that guy looks more like a football player, or, a wrestler. And you developed into one of the top coaches in the country, and we have so many. And so I'm very fortunate to have you two and many others are part of this. That I'm very grateful.
Yeah, and sincere thank you for, like I said, pioneering this industry, because again, I wouldn't be in this position. Jeff wouldn't be in that position if we didn't have the kind of the model that you created to kind of expedite, cauliflower meathead to come into the endurance space and start coaching people on how to race bikes faster. So for me personally, I thank you. And I think a lot of our audience who tunes into the Train Right podcast probably says the same thing, because our job here as coaches, and with what we're doing on the podcast, is relay some of this cutting edge technology to them, and also remind everybody of where this stuff came from, because 20 years ago, it was 1,000% different, right? It just didn't exist, right? You created it. So I think we're all on this, fast track of things are adapting and evolving very quickly. And it's cool to, again, get you both on the podcast, talk about some of the history of this, and see where it's all going. So thank you both.
Yeah. Thanks, Adam.
Thanks, Adam.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
Take care, Pep.